Okay, and I am Professor Pete Mandic at William Patterson University, and I teach classes in philosophy of mind and logic and philosophy of science and related topics. So, one way to talk about this is in terms of classic brain-in-a-vat thought experiment. Now, there's a version of the brain-in-a-vat thought experiment whereby the brain in question has just popped into existence. It has no causal history. It is just, if you think of a brain as a finite number of atoms, then you can calculate the probability that such a number of atoms will come together and form a brain. There's a non-zero probability. It's not impossible that a bunch of atoms, just like it's not impossible that all the atoms in the air of this room will just at random collect into the corner of the room, and then I would suffocate because there's no air where I need it to be. There's a non-zero probability that the atoms will do that at random. There's a non-zero probability that a bunch of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen in my backyard will just spontaneously form a brain that is intrinsically the same as my brain. And as far as what's going on internally, it's similar to what's going on in my brain. And there's one way of thinking about what semantic content is that it depends on certain kinds of causal relations to the environment, maybe historical causal relations to the environment, and this hypothetical, spontaneously arising brain wouldn't have those historical relations. And so even though the brain that just popped into existence is, in terms of internal structure, just like my brain, it isn't able to think about things like, for example, sandwiches or Ferris wheels, because it hasn't had the appropriate causal history that would relate it to actual sandwiches in its environment or actual Ferris wheels. So even though I might be thinking about maybe one day going on a Ferris wheel and eating a sandwich, the brain, according to a certain approach to some psychosemantics or neurosemantics, this spontaneously arising brain, it wouldn't have that intentional content. There's one way of describing the sorts of issues and that the Searle argument concerns, and that is in terms of the vocabulary of syntax and semantics. And you can frame this question about whether whether there's any set of syntactical relations or syntactical operations that would suffice for there to be semantics. So, I think maybe lots of people might agree that not just any old syntax will do. Just because you have some kind of physical system that you could describe as following certain rules or having certain kind of rule-governed behavior, that might suffice for syntax, but that wouldn't automatically suffice for semantics. But the one way of framing the question of whether artificial intelligence is possible is whether there's like at least one syntactic system that, in virtue of having the particular kind of syntactical operations that it has, would thereby suffice to have semantic content. And now, I mean, this raises a whole bunch of questions, and one of them is, well, really, what is syntax? And one way of thinking about what syntax is supposed to be is in terms of something like intrinsic structures and causal relations between parts of an intrinsic structure. So, for example, if we think about the robot reply to the Searle argument, the robot reply says, well, the Chinese room by itself, that wouldn't have any kind of that wouldn't give rise to any semantic content. But if you took the Chinese room and you stuck it in a robot so that it was the things that were going on in the room were responding to inputs that were coming in through cameras, and the things that were going out of the room were ultimately driving arms and legs and allowing this robot to move around in its environment, then you would take the Chinese room and it would be embodied, and it would be embedded in an environment. It'd be responding to an environment. And so, like, one thing you might say is that in the Chinese room prior to being stuck in the robot and the Chinese room after the robot, in each case you've got the same set of syntactic relations. One way of thinking about what syntax is it's just the set of relations between the symbols that are inside the room, and there's no difference about those the intrinsic structural properties of what's going on inside of the room. What changes is that when you take the room and you stick it in the robot, now a symbol is ultimately being caused because the robot's camera is pointing at a tree instead of pointing at a river or a stream. And in virtue of these kinds of causal relations that lead to the outside of the robot's body, this inner syntactic item now takes on this semantic content. But the inner syntactic item, it's not doing anything different than it would have been or could have been doing prior to sticking the Chinese room into a robot. So one way of thinking about what syntax is, it's the sort of stuff that would be going on in the Chinese room, regardless of whether the Chinese room was inside of a robot or not. And to relate this to brains, you might think then that my brain and the hypothetical isomorphic brain that just has no causal history, it just popped into existence at random in my backyard, that both my brain and that hypothetical just born a few seconds ago brain, they're syntactically identical. They have the exact same they have this exact same intrinsic states. The intrinsic states are causally related to one another in exactly the same ways. If you were to say that the brain that's in a body and has a certain kind of causal relation to an environment, it gives rise to semantic content, but the just born brain doesn't. Or if you similarly were to say that unless you stick it in a robot body, a Chinese room is not going to give rise to semantic content. But if you were to say that just the unembodied Chinese room or the brain that had no history, they wouldn't have any semantic content. But the other brain, the brain that was in the body and the robot, they would have semantic content. One way of describing that is not in terms of saying that syntax would suffice for semantics. It's syntax plus something else, but it's not syntax by itself, because we're describing this in such a way that syntactically the two Chinese rooms are identical, and syntactically the two brains are identical. So if you are tempted to describe these situations in that way, then maybe you don't want to describe your position as saying that there's any kind of syntax that would suffice for semantic content. That instead, what would suffice for semantic content is a certain set of syntactic relations plus this extra stuff. The extra stuff is stuff that would lead from what's going on inside of the brain or inside of the computer to what's going on in the body of the robot and or the states of the environment. So, one thing I wonder about is what would Searle say about them? Would he throw up his hands and say, "Ah, you got me," or would he have some kind of counter argument? And I'm betting that he probably would have some kind of counter argument. That's usually how it goes in philosophy. And one sort of thing that I imagine his response would be kind of similar to what he already says about the system's reply. The system's reply, says, okay, right, John Searle in the Chinese room. John Searle doesn't understand Chinese, but the whole system does understand Chinese, and the whole system is this larger thing that has John Searle as just a proper part. The larger thing includes, in addition to John Searle, it includes the rule book that he's consulting. It includes the various Chinese symbols that he's looking at. It includes the symbols that are coming in through the input slots and the symbols that he's sending out through the output slots. And his response to that systems reply that says the whole system that has intentionality or understanding. He says, well, I can imagine internalizing all of that. So instead of writing things down on pieces of paper, I just memorize all that sort of stuff, so that when in theory, it's possible for me, John Searle, to memorize all the rules in the book, including all the illustrations that are in the book, so that when you show me a Chinese character, I can just think back through my memory palace like Sherlock Holmes and find the right symbol and find the right instruction that will lead me in my memory palace to the other room where I get the other symbol, and then I write the correct answer on a piece of paper. I could do all of that. It's happening inside of me, and so now there isn't this external thing that you could say is the whole system that of which I'm just a proper part. I am the whole system, and I still don't understand Chinese. I'm doing all the things that a functionalist or a AI advocate would say would suffice for understanding Chinese. I'm doing all those things, but I still don't understand Chinese. He's like the pilot of the robot, right? And so he's doing all the stuff that would allow the robot to, from the outside observer, it seems like the robot understands Chinese, but on the inside there is no Chinese understanding. On the inside, there's just John Searle, like the little green guy in Men in Black. There's that one. They open up that like robot's face, and there's like a little green alien driving the robot.
Yeah.
That's John Searle. He's a little green philosopher, John Searle, and so I'm inclined that if we're remembering the robot reply correctly, I'm inclined to think that Searle would just press that reply again. He would say, I don't care what kind of computer you're talking about. If it's not a brain, then it's still a computer, and I could do all those things that the computer is doing. It doesn't matter if you stick it inside of a robot or not. I could do all the things that it's doing, and I still wouldn't understand Chinese. And so therefore, whatever it is doing, that doesn't suffice for understanding Chinese. I suspect that that's what he would say. But suppose we had a robot that was programmed to recognize faces. And so we show the robot, a picture of your face, and we show it a picture of my face, and we say that's Pete Mandic, and then we train it on like 100 different faces, and it gets pretty good. As far as behaviorally, the way it behaves is about the way that a human would behave, who you would be tempted to describe as really good at recognizing faces. Like they could, some people. You probably have friends that are like this. They're just like really good at recognizing celebrities. You're like, who's that guy? And they're like, I know, it's John Smith, and they always get it right. They're super recognizers. And so imagine this. Imagine we got John Searle, and John Searle has never laid eyes on you. He's never seen you with his naked eyes, and he's never seen a photograph of you, and neither has he seen me. He's never been introduced to me, never laid eyes on me or any photograph of me. And he's inside the room, and what is he doing? He's manipulating representations that none of them themselves look like you or look like me. And he's driving this robot around, and the robot is producing sounds, says the robot. That guy over there is Pete Mandic, says the robot. And inside the room, it's just Searle's just pushing buttons and stuff. And if you took Searle out of the room, and you showed him me or a picture of me, or if you showed him you or a picture of you, it said, do you recognize these guys? He would say no. If you asked him, who are these guys? He would say, I don't know. I've never seen them before. So that's we're not talking about understanding Chinese. We're talking about a different kind of mental state now. But it's a kind of it's still a kind of knowledge, I guess. In the case of understanding Chinese, what the person is saying. In the case of facial recognition, whether you've seen that face before, and you might know even further who that face is. Identifying information and can apply it a visual presentation of the face. So, John Searle, he himself doesn't know who you are, and he doesn't recognize who you are, but he's pushing the buttons inside of the robot, and the robot is making these behaviors that would, on the outside, would seem like he's pretty good at recognizing faces. It seems to me John Searle would just give the same argument again. He would say, you know what, like this this shows that artificial intelligence is baloney. That I could do all the things that you're saying would suffice for recognizing faces, but this shows that doesn't suffice, because I could do that without myself knowing who you are. I could do that without being able to recognize your face. The Pamela, the thing about the Pamela Anderson neurons is intriguing. I don't think anyone would want to say that the neuron by itself understands who Pamela Anderson is. Like we could take that neuron out and keep it alive in a petri dish, and we could stimulate it, give it a little electric shock, and that probably wouldn't suffice to be a system that is thereby thinking about Pamela Anderson. And probably a neuron would have to be hooked up to a much larger system in order for there to be any recognition or awareness or thinking about Pamela Anderson. But there is, I think, an important question about like how much of the system. So, for example, I could get a haircut, and you could shave me bald, and you could cut my fingernails and toenails, and I'd still be able to think about Pamela Anderson. You could chop off my arms and legs, and I'd still be able to think about Pamela Anderson, right? Probably that wouldn't affect my ability to think about Pamela Anderson. And we could, we could get rid of Pamela Anderson. Not that I'm recommending anyone bring any harm to Pamela Anderson, but if she just exploded, stopped existing, that's fine. I don't need her anymore. I can still think about Pamela Anderson. So it seems like there's a lot of stuff that is dispensable, and the single neuron doesn't seem like enough. But do we really need the whole body and the whole environment, including Pamela Anderson? That seems too extreme. Also, it seems like we need something a little bit smaller and a little bit more narrow. But how small and how narrow? That's a really, really tough question. Well, one thing I suspect about all the John Searle stuff, that ultimately artificial intelligence is great. There's at least some artificial systems that would suffice for intentionality. But ultimately, the Searle argument isn't successful. My suspicion about the Searle argument is that it's just way too strong, that you could use something like his argument to prove that, not even brains would suffice for Chinese understanding. If you really pushed it, I think you could use something like the Chinese argument to try to prove substance dualism, and I assume that that's a reductio ad absurdum. That if the Chinese room argument is proving substance dualism, that something has gone totally wrong. I don't think substance dualism is really a serious contender. And one way of thinking about the basic thing going on with the Chinese room argument is by comparing it to some very similar sorts of thought experiments in philosophy of mind. So one kind of thought experiment is the zombie thought experiment, and this is, with the zombie thought experiment, you are looking at someone else, you're contemplating someone else, and you hypothesize that they're physically the same as you, they're behaviorally the same as you, and maybe even internally physically the same as you. And then you say, well, conceivably there's just nothing going on in there. Even though they have all the same physical properties, they don't have the same mental properties. And another related thought experiment in philosophy of mind is Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's thought experiment of the mill from his monadology. There's at one point in the monadology where he ultimately wants to defend a kind of idealism, but he's arguing against materialists like, for example, Hobbes, and he's saying, look, these materialists, they think that what a mind is a brain, and that's just crazy, and here I'm going to show you how. If what a mind was a brain, that means that a mind would be a complex. It would be made out of multiple parts that are causally interacting. And I can imagine myself shrunk down, and I go inside of a brain as if I were walking around inside of a mill, like walking around inside of a factory. And all I would see would be these different mechanical pieces pushing and pulling one another. And I certainly wouldn't see anything that would suffice to explain anything mental. I wouldn't. In Leibniz's case, he focuses on perception. He says, I wouldn't see anything inside of this mill that would suffice to explain perception. And then he goes from there to say, therefore, minds have to be simple things, and what a mind really is a monad. It's a simple substance. The reason I want to compare these three thought experiments is to note some key similarities and differences. With the zombie thought experiment, you're examining a person from the outside, from the third person point of view. I might look at you and say, you seem like you have a human body like me. You have eyes, and you have a head, and yeah, I bet you even have a brain. But for all I know, you don't have any kind of mental states. You don't have anything going on mentally. So I'm viewing someone from the outside. With the Leibniz argument, Leibniz shrinks down and he goes inside of the brain. So he's not viewing the brain from the outside. He's viewing it from the inside. But in both of these cases, there's something kind of passive. With Searle adds an extra ingredient. So not only is he going inside by going inside the Chinese room, he's doing what the artificial intelligence people and the functionalists say you should be doing. So, Leibniz, when he's in the mill, he's not making the mill do anything. He's just observing it passively. But Searle becomes the mill. He does what the mill is supposed to be doing. And he says, aha, it's not just me observing it and saying, I bet, this could happen without there being any, without any understanding. I am doing it, and I know what I understand, and I know that I don't understand Chinese, even though I'm doing all the things that you artificial intelligence people say that I could do. So, like part of what's crucial in the Searle argument is that he's doing the things that his opponents say you're supposed to be doing, and second, he is going in there with knowledge. In the zombie thought experiment, you don't really know. You're saying like, well, for all I know, and similarly with the Leibniz thought experiment, he's not saying he knows that there's no perception going on in the factory. He's saying that for all he knows that there's no perception. But the genius of the Searle argument is he claims to have knowledge. Like, I know that I don't understand Chinese, and I could nonetheless I could do all those things that are supposed to suffice, but since I still wouldn't know. And I think you could take that kind of argument and you could direct it at just plain old brains instead of a functional isomorph to a brain, just a brain. as long as the brain admits of some kind of like coarse-grained causal description, and it could be something pretty fine-grained. It could be something down to the level of molecules or whatever. Whatever you think it is that brains are doing, you could shrink down a Searle and you could have him do all those things. As long as you grant to him in the first place that he knows what he thinks he knows, he can always assert that he could do those things without having the knowledge of Chinese or the knowledge of faces. But he could do the things, and so yeah, I think you could whatever you think brains are doing. And by the way, Searle, he claims to love brains, but he never tells us what's so great about brains. He doesn't tell us what brains are doing that computers couldn't. I think if someone were to commit and were to say what brains are doing, then you could bring in a version of Searle that says, I could do that too without understanding Chinese. And I think really the right way to respond to the Searle arguments is to just not grant that he has that kind of knowledge. And what's the kind of knowledge that he claims to have? He claims to, number one, know the inside of his own mind. And further, he claims to know the inside of his own mind across a wide range of counterfactual situations. So it's one thing to say, like, I know right now what I'm thinking. So like right now I know I'm thinking about my coffee cup. But it's another thing to say that I know that I would be thinking about my coffee cup if I was surfing on a wave of lava while standing on a titanium surfboard. Like, that's a counterfactual situation. That's a much stronger kind of knowledge than simply asserting knowledge of what's going on in the actual situation. So Searle is claiming to have a very strong kind of knowledge about his own mental states, and further, he's claiming that he knows what his knowledge would be across this wide range of counterfactual scenarios, really crazy scenarios in which he is, doing all of this stuff that anybody plausibly would say that a so-called Chinese understanding computer program would need to do. Even if it is a lookup table instead of a neural network program, it's still going to be incredibly complicated, and it's just kind of a little bit ridiculous to think that Searle could do that in the first place. In the old-fashioned version of the room where he still has a book and the papers, but it's even more ridiculous in the version where he internalizes it. He memorizes the rule book and he memorizes the papers. So that's like this really, really, really far out scenario, and I don't think we should grant him that he still is an authority about what he would know. I think the way to think about this is to say that kind of first-person methodology where you focus on what's going on the inside of your own mind and then try to reason about counterfactual scenarios. I think we should just say, you know what, that's garbage. Forget about that. Forget about the Chinese room. Let's think about intentionality from a third-person point of view. And the kind of neurosemantic approach that Chris Eliasmith favors, or the kind of approach to artificial intelligence where you say, like, Stanley, the DARPA, what was it, Volkswagen, DARPA mobile, Stanley the DARPA mobile. Yeah, Stanley has got intentional content. Stanley has knowledge. What does Stanley know? Stanley knows how to win the race. Stanley knows how to avoid obstacles. Stanley might be able to recognize that something is an obstacle, and maybe thus, in some sense, have a concept of an obstacle. So it's got a certain kind of conceptual or propositional knowledge. It knows that. It knows that it has finished the race. It knows that the thing that it's looking at is an obstacle. And the criteria that we apply to Stanley are very much the criteria that we apply to one another. They're criteria that are answerable to these sorts of third-person accessible pieces of evidence. They're largely behavioral criteria. That's how we know. And the first-person access that we have actually plays a relatively small role in propping all this up. And maybe I might even go so far as say something extreme that we do that afterwards. Like the people learn how to talk about themselves and have some kind of grasp on their own mental states after they are first conversant in these third-person applications of mental states. So I think that's the way to go against Searle, is to just kind of hit the ground running, blowing him off. And the thing to blow off is to blow off this this kind of very strong first personalism, where you grant to Searle that he does know what's going on in his own mind in such a strong way that it's generalizable across a wide range of counterfactual scenarios. We just say, no, sorry, you don't know that. But what we do know is of one another that we have mental states. We do know that. We know, look, I know that you have a mind and that you're intelligent and you're not just a lookup table. I know that. And how am I able to know that? Well, it's not because I scanned your brain. So I didn't check to see if you have a brain. You might just have a bunch of microchips going on in there. You might be a cyborg. I don't care. It's fine by me. I'm not a chauvinist.